Hello, and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver, and I'm a scientist, and this is Cindy Oliver, and she's a dog. So, Dr. Campbell is at it again. This time, he has jumped on a paper from Denmark that has been doing the rounds that purports to show a difference in adverse events depending on batches of vaccine. Now, the paper does in fact show that, but there is a rather obvious explanation for the difference that isn't discussed in the paper. And in his usual style, John decides to add his own commentary and go beyond the paper. He even has a rather hilarious interview with one of the authors of the paper, which we'll get onto. But first, I just wanted to point out that there are actually two papers about this subject in the journal. The first paper is this one here, which is a research letter with the title Batch-Dependent Safety of the BNT162b2 mRNA COVID-19 Vaccine. And it's essentially a paper looking at adverse events reported after the Pfizer vaccine in Denmark and comparing them to batch numbers. The second paper has the same title, but it is a commentary on the original paper that explains why the whole premise of the first paper is absolute bollocks. For some strange reason, John only discusses the first paper. But let's hear what John has to say.
71% of suspected adverse reactions, the SARs, occurred in 4.2% of the vaccine batches.
Okay, let's just stop there for a minute because John makes a mistake here that he makes continuously throughout the video. He refers to adverse reactions, but the paper isn't looking at adverse reactions. It is looking at adverse events. An adverse event is anything unwanted that happens after a vaccine. It isn't necessarily something caused by the vaccine. It could just be a coincidence. Here's a video of someone you may recognise explaining it.
Because what we have to remember, of course, is the people that were vaccinated first were the elderly and those most at risk that were vaccinated first. And of course, it's just part of life that these people often die frequently. The probability of surviving the year goes down quite substantially. So for this proportion of vulnerable people and elderly people to die after they've received a vaccine is not surprising. They would have died whether they'd received the vaccine or not. How do I know this? Well, these are all reported. A review of available clinical information is carried out by physicians from the CDC and the FDA. They get all the information. They look at death certificates. They look at autopsy reports. Now, we don't have autopsies in the United Kingdom, in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. We have post-mortems, after death. It's the same thing. You basically get the body and you examine it to work out the cause of death and bits and bobs about it. They take into account medical records. And by the way, post-mortem information, autopsy report, is the most accurate diagnosis you can possibly get because you're actually looking at the diseased organ. Medical records, and the bottom line is all of these revealed no link with vaccinations. So if you take an elderly group of people, you take 41 million of them, it's not surprising with the normal cycle of life that 1,170 of them die within a relatively short period of time of any specific point in time that you are talking about. It just so happens that this point in time was when they were vaccinated. So this reflects the cycle of life. It does not reflect a problem with the vaccines.
Thanks, John. I think he explained that really well. Just because something happens after a vaccine, it doesn't mean it is caused by the vaccine. Of course, John is specifically talking about deaths here, which account for less than 1% of the adverse events in the study that we are discussing, but it's the same principle for all adverse events.
Now here we have a graph here. Now this is the graph from the authors. Now what this is showing is any dot here higher up is related to more suspected adverse events. Any dot lower down is related to less suspected adverse events. And as we see here, the authors put them into clusters. So we've got this blue cluster here, mostly vaccines given early. Then we've got this intermediate green one here. And then we've got this yellow one on the bottom. And we see that here, for example, we have massively high rates of adverse reactions.
Now, before we get on to why these differences are exactly what you would expect, there are a few things that John didn't really make clear. This figure shows all adverse events, not just serious adverse events. And in fact, the majority of the adverse events are not serious. This is what it says in the paper. Compared to the rates of all SAEs, serious SAEs and SAE-related deaths per 1.000 doses were much less frequent, and numbers of these SAEs per 1,000 doses displayed considerably greater variability between batches, with lesser separation between the three trend lines. Not shown. I'm assuming the 1.000 doses is a typo and it should say 1,000, but who knows? What they are saying, though, is for serious adverse events and deaths, there is not the same difference in the trend lines, but they are choosing not to actually show us the data. Interesting. It's almost like they don't want to draw too much attention to it because it could detract from the story they are trying to tell. The other thing that John didn't make clear is that the figure shows the number of adverse events reported, not the number of people who had adverse events. So, for instance, if you had a headache, fever, and fatigue after your vaccine, that would be classified as 3 adverse events, and there were, in fact, 3.19 adverse events reported per person. So, knowing all this, let's look at why there were more adverse events reported in the blue batches. Now, as John says in the video, the blue batches were the first batches administered. Believe it or not, this information is not in the paper. It was pointed out to the authors after the paper was published. And what, of course, this means is that all the paper is showing is that there were more adverse events reported early in the rollout of the vaccine compared with later in the rollout, which is exactly what you would expect. The first reason you would expect this is pointed out by Dr. Line Mikan, whose name I've probably pronounced horribly wrong, so apologies, Dr. Mikan. And she's the head of Division for Pharmacovigilance at the Danish Medicines Agency, and what she said is reported in this article here. And the Danish Medicines Agency are responsible for the data that the paper is based on. So obviously she is someone who knows the data really well. And what she explains is that early in the rollout, healthcare professionals were expected to report anything they suspected could be a side effect, as well as any morbidity. And the reason for this was so that the Danish Medicines Agency, in collaboration with the European Medicines Agency, could capture different patterns of side effects as quickly as possible. As time went on, this was no longer required, so adverse event reporting levels dropped. And having more reports of adverse events early in the rollout of a medication is a well-known phenomenon that is known as the Weber effect. And the reason for the increase is because older drugs are thought to be better understood as they have been around for a longer time, and therefore clinicians feel that there is less need to report adverse events because everyone already knows what they are. The other reason for higher adverse event reporting early in the rollout relates to the groups who were first in line to receive the vaccine. This list shows the order that the vaccines were rolled out to the various groups. As you can see, first in line for the vaccines were people who were particularly vulnerable to severe disease, as well as healthcare workers. And both these groups are more likely to report adverse events than the general population. Vulnerable people are more likely to report adverse events because the conditions that leave them vulnerable are more likely to result in adverse events. And remember, the data in this paper are adverse events that happen to occur after vaccination, not necessarily adverse events from the vaccine, as John explained so well in the previous clip. And healthcare workers are also more likely to report adverse events after medications. This isn't because they are more likely to suffer from them, they are just more likely to report them, which makes sense because they are more familiar with the reporting system. Remember, the majority of the adverse events shown in the figure from the paper are non-serious adverse events that the majority of people wouldn't bother to report. Like, got a sore arm, got a headache, feel a bit tired after your vaccine. Some people would report that, but most people wouldn't, but a healthcare worker is more likely to. It's also worth pointing out that the authors of the paper only had access to how many vaccines were shipped in each batch. They had no information on how many of the vaccines were actually administered. So lower incidences of adverse events could also just reflect less vaccines administered.
If I'd known about this graph and these high rates of potential side effects, 1 in 20 vaccines given, come on. Is there any way I would have accepted that vaccine? Emphatically not. In fact, if I'd known I was on the green line somewhere with 1 in 1,000, I wouldn't have taken it either. There's just a huge issue here of informed consent. Now, these batches were given out all over the world.
Right. So Johnny's claiming that if he had known that there was a 1 in 20 incidence of minor adverse events after the vaccine, which is 5%, he wouldn't have taken it. If you think this sounds a bit far-fetched, you're right. Here is what John actually said at the time.
People who'd had 1 dose of Pfizer, here they followed up 282,000 people. And of that 282,000 people, 13% had systemic side effects. 13%. For the first dose of Pfizer, and 71.9% had local side effects, mostly very mild. So 13% on the first vaccine for the Pfizer. For the second dose of the Pfizer, 28,207 people were followed up who'd had the second dose of the Pfizer, and there 22% developed side effects. So we see that more people get side effects with the second dose. So 13% got side effects with the first dose, systemic side effects, 22% with the second dose of the Pfizer. So personally, I'm just waiting incredibly impatiently for my second dose of Pfizer. But when I do, I'll have a 22% chance of getting systemic side effects, which is a price I'm more than happy to pay.
So John was happy to accept a 22% chance of systemic side effects, but now he's claiming that he wouldn't have been happy to accept a 5% chance.
Formation or another potential side effect, or another potential serious adverse reaction.
D asterisk asterisk asterisk. I wonder what that could mean. What do you think, Cindy? I think you're right. He's talking about doggies. Sorry for the frivolity, but Cindy insisted. I'm guessing John is trying to make out that he can't say the word because of censorship. Rather hilarious given how many videos he has made about the D word.
Now, just to be completely clear, the authors had no conflict of interest other than certain papers that could be discussed where there's potential conflict of interest. The authors worked very, very hard on this on their own, and this is the data they got.
I'm a bit confused about this bit. Is he saying the authors don't have any conflicts of interest except for the papers where they might? Anyway, regardless of whether they have any conflicts of interest, at least one of the 3 authors, Dr. Vibeke Manniche, has formed for spreading COVID misinformation. And one of the other authors is her husband. And it just so happens that Dr. Campbell managed to score an interview with Dr. Manniche. Let's have a little look.
So the blue batches, they were given early on in the pandemic.
They were given when we started to vaccinate, which was in, January, February, March 2021. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were early on, but it included the elderly who were vulnerable and healthcare workers who were young.
Yes, and actually the distribution of age, older than 70 is actually the same between all three groups, even a little more in the green and a little more also in the yellow. So because I see the discussion, this has gone viral, especially the last 2 weeks. And I see the discussion that someone will say, well, that's just because it was the elderly and fragile, but that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
So this is basically a straw man argument. The proportion of people who are over 70 in the blue group is irrelevant. The people who received vaccines early owing to their vulnerability weren't necessarily over 70. And those that were had additional vulnerabilities that made them more prone to adverse events than other people that age. Because these are adverse events and not necessarily vaccine reactions. Let me just point out the top vulnerable groups: residents in nursing homes, people over 65 years who receive both personal care and practical assistance, people aged over 85 years, which is quite a bit older than 70, persons with pre-existing conditions who have significantly higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19. People who were just over 70 and didn't have any other issues were not vaccinated until later. And of course, we also have healthcare workers who, as we've already discussed, have higher reporting rates than the general population. So it makes no sense to use a proportion of people in each group over 70 as an argument. It's also not clear whether she is talking about the number of people in each group who received vaccines or the number of people who reported adverse events.
Now, the other trend we notice on this graph, Vibeke, is the classic positive correlation. What we find is that the vaccines that had, for example, here where we've got this one, we've got a higher number of vaccines per batch are associated with a higher number of side effects. It's almost as if there was more side effects associated with larger batches and less side effects associated with smaller batches, almost as if there was some problem with the quality of the higher batch production than the lower batch production. What do we make of this?
We have talked about that, but it would be difficult. You can see from the line yourself, you're right about that. But saying so, we haven't got that much into that. And that is the thing also. For us, it has been important to say, what can we show and what can we reckon from that? Yeah. Because our study is just a small part of a big puzzle.
This bit is truly bizarre. If there are more doses in a batch, obviously there are more opportunities for adverse events. So you would expect to see a positive correlation between batch size and number of adverse events. In fact, the main argument of the paper is that this isn't occurring across all batches. The really weird thing, though, is that Dr. Manniche, who should be familiar with her own paper, doesn't correct Dr. Campbell.
So the Journal of the American Medical Association turned you down.
Yes.
The New England Journal of Medicine turned you down. Which other journals turned you down?
And the Lancet and Archives of Internal Medicine.
Lancet turned you down, and Archives of Internal Medicine.
Yes.
I have a question. I have a question for the editors of JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, and Archives of Internal Medicine. Can you tell us what was wrong with Vibeke's science, please? Because I've read this paper, and to me, it's a good scientific paper. we need. Did they give you a rationale as to why this paper was refused?
No, and that is also the thing, because you have this peer review process, which this was through also, and they didn't even send it for peer review. So this was like the chief editor who decided, no, this is not something for us, and they just gave us, like a blunt, just a blunt talk about there was so much interesting studies coming in. So unfortunately, no, thank you. But this was literally within hours and few days that they decided. I could understand if they had sent it for peer review and the peers said, "Oh no, it's no good." But this is actually a very excellent and a very through work study. So I'm very proud of it, because I think it's well written, and everything. So it's like, if they had sent it for peer review, then I would have accepted that. Okay, fair enough. But they didn't, and that's the only word I can get into my head is censorship.
Now, I assume they meant to say Annals of Internal Medicine as opposed to Archives of Internal Medicine, but that's by the by. The other three journals that they mentioned, the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA, are all top-tier, high-impact journals, and they typically reject about 95% of manuscripts that they receive. And in most cases, they are rejected without going out for peer review. It is known as desk rejection, and it pretty much happens with any quality journal. There are many reasons for a desk rejection. Sometimes it is because the manuscript doesn't fit within the scope of the journal, or sometimes it's because the work isn't significant, novel or impactful enough, or sometimes it is because there are obvious flaws in the research methodology or study design, or sometimes it is all of the above, or something else again. In the case of the paper that we have been discussing in this video, it's not remotely surprising that it was desk rejected. Most people who were familiar with the vaccine rollout process would expect there to be a difference in adverse events reported per batch, for the reasons that we have previously discussed. So there is nothing significant, novel, or impactful about the paper. And the fact that the authors haven't picked this up points to poor research methodology, which is, of course, another reason to have rejected it. So there is no censorship. There are no conspiracies. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Manniche are just unfamiliar with scientific publishing practices.
No time for conspiracy theories on this when the data is so transparent and publicly available.
Another great point from the John I used to know. Alas, I think he may be gone forever. If you'd like to look further into the data I presented, I provided links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked, shared, or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And of course, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee or little Cindy here a treat. We really appreciate your support. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to see them, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.